Hey listeners, last year was our 15th year of the best in food storytelling. As we head into 2025, we're kicking off a contest in collaboration with the podcast series Feast and Harmony and Sixth Man, where you have the opportunity to win a 4-night cruise for 2 on Chefs Making Waves, a food, wine, and spirits festival at sea. When you donate to HRN, you'll be entered for the chance to win a porthole cabin for 2 on Chefs Making Waves, sailing May 5th through 9th, 2025, from Miami to Cozumel, Mexico on Norwegian Gem. You'll also support another year of great food storytelling with a portion of your donation going toward disaster relief for the food and beverage communities within Western North Carolina and Southern California. This cruise is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for culinary adventurers, featuring top celebrity chefs including Jonathan Waxman, Antonio Lafaso, Robert Irvine, and many, many more. There's a myriad of experiences such as restaurant takeovers, live food and mixology demos, themed parties, and more. To enter your chance to win, please visit heritageradionetwork.org/cruise. Terms and conditions apply. You must be 21 or over to enter. That's heritageradionetwork.org/cruise.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We've been making cheese in Wisconsin since before we were even a state, which may be one reason why we win so many awards for it. It's what happens when a whole state dreams in cheese. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hi, and welcome to A Taste of the Past. I'm your host, Linda Palacio, on this journey through culinary history. And today we're going to be talking about Nigeria. Nigerian food, of course. Nigeria is one of 16 countries in tropical West Africa, having gained its independence in 1960. And it's known as having the largest economy in Africa. But what seems even larger to me is the extent and the variety of its food and cooking of the various regions. From her new book, Chop Chop, Cooking the Food of Nigeria, Azaz Soko shares descriptions and background of many of these spices, ingredient combinations, and recipes of regional classics and contemporary dishes which have evolved over time. From indigenous nuts and seeds and salts to the colonial imposition of bouillon cubes, the author educates us on how the geography and history have shaped the complex cuisine of Nigeria. Azaz is a Nigerian food writer and educator. A geologist by training, she began documenting her food journey on her blog Kitchen Butterfly in 2009. Central to her work is connectedness through food, food sovereignty, cultural identity, reclamation of food systems, and the joy of eating, of course. Her research and documentation explore the roots of Nigerian and West African cuisine, the impact of West African intellectual contributions to global development from the Americas South through the Caribbean to Europe, Central and South Americas, and the connection to the Afro diaspora. Azaz is a professor of food and tourism at Centennial College in Ontario, Canada. As I said, her new book, Chop Chop, is published by Artisan. It's coming out next month. Welcome, Azaz.
Thank you very much, Linda. It's my absolute pleasure to be here.
You are talking to me from Canada. Tell me where you live. It's very interesting.
Okay, so I'm joining you today from the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. It's land of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Wyandot nations, past, present, and future. And it's close to Toronto. So if you're familiar with the east coast of Canada, that's somewhere there. Southeast, yes.
Yes. And I did not know that territory existed. I mean, I've only been to Toronto, I think once. Yeah, once. And love it. But that's very interesting to me. But on to Nigeria, which is also very interesting to me. I mean, the book excited me so much because I had a show on other West African cuisines, Senegal, for instance, and others. that you go into such wonderful detail and description. And I hope you'll share some of that today. We'll get to that. But to start out with, the book is called Chop Chop, and I know you have an interesting background and history with food. What does chop mean or signify and to
Well,
us?
first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for your delightful words about discovering Nigerian cuisine through the book Chop Chop. I am thrilled. In Nigeria, when you think about the word chop and its lexical use, it's all about food and eating, whether that is, the physical act of eating or chopping, as we say, or a variety of combinations of chop that mean different things. So a chop chop in Nigeria is someone who loves food, someone who's obsessed with food, eating, a gastronome, if you would. And when I started thinking about my journey and exploration with food, it seemed apt and it seemed like it seemed suitable to convey my love for food, my deep joy with consuming it, but also all of the other aspects that go beyond eating, the history, the culture, the technique, the understanding of the evolution of different aspects of food culture. So Chop is all about food and eating and enjoyment.
Mhm. And from reading about you, I know, and you write about your journey, and I know you had a very complex relationship with food as a child.
Yeah. It's my family look at me now and there's a strong sense of disbelief because as a child I hated food and it was a struggle for anyone to get me to eat. That the tide turned for the better when I was about 9 and my dad took my older sister and I to Edinburgh in Scotland. At the time, we lived in Nigeria and we went to visit my aunt, my cousin. She's much older than me, so we call her aunt, in Edinburgh. And I think that I really worked up an appetite on one particular day. We had been to like a festival. We walked up and down the Princess Street and I was hungry. I think for the first time in my life, I was hungry. And so when we went into Wimpy's, which is one of the very early fast food places.
Oh, burger shop, right?
Yes, I asked for a burger and fries and Mirinda and devoured it, asked for seconds, and then cried because I was full to the point of pain. But I always say that I haven't looked back since that encounter with hunger and with food.
Well, you certainly have delved into it in a deep way, and I thank you for that because I thank you for this book too. And you were originally a geologist. How did you decide to start writing about food and exploring food deeper?
Okay, so I did spend the first 20 years of this period of my adulthood as an exploration geologist. So I went to university, studied geology, graduated, and worked as a geologist. And it was while living and working in the Netherlands and being incredibly homesick, but also not really enjoying my job or work with geology that I turned to food. Around 2008, it was a Friday. I remember the day that I decided to go down the path of writing about food. It was Friday evening. I'd come back from work and I was making Chinese style fried rice. And in the background, in my open kitchen in Wassenaar, the part of the Netherlands I lived in, there was my friend Paula, who's Mexican. She was working on her blog. And then there was my former partner, Ogba, who was sitting and also working on his blog. And both of them were writing and, we were all conversing and chatting as I diced up green bell peppers and carrots. And I was like, oh, actually, the way we all chat and talk, we're all writers and they have blogs and they're working on blogs. I could have a blog as well. And I'd been reading blogs for years. Clotilde of Chocolate and Zucchini. There were a few blogs I'd been reading, and I was like, that aha moment, like I too could write a blog. And then from there on out, it was just thinking about what I wanted the blog to be called, how I wanted to lay it out and design it. And that was really the root and start of this journey with exploring food. And it also gave me an outlet because I wasn't really enjoying my job or my work as a geologist. And so it was a good way to transition into something else that I had interest and passion for.
Well, working in all those foreign countries, all those different countries, you must have longed for a particular flavor or a dish. What was the one thing when you were living, let's say, in the Netherlands, that when you thought of food of home, of Nigerian food, what did you crave? What did you think about?
I craved suya, and this grilled, spiced sticks of typically beef that were very reminiscent of kebabs around the world. And suya was the one dish that led me to, one, figuring out what the recipe was. Because growing up, you never needed to learn how to make suya. All you needed to do was walk down the street, find your suya man, you would buy some, you'd go home, you'd enjoy it. There was never a need or desire to learn how to make it or craft it. Living in the Netherlands changed all of that. It led me to learning how to make suya, but also finding alternative ways to make the characteristic peanut spice blend that, lends suya its very distinct and distinctive flavor. So yes, suya was definitely high up on that list.
And that's traditionally a street food in particular?
Traditionally street food.
Yeah.
You would go evenings, you'd go buy it with your friends, family, partner. Yeah.
Well, when I was reading through the book and trying to, in my head, capture a flavor. Yes, I do taste in my head but from reading a lot of cookbooks and studying food for a long time. It was very difficult in a way to get a taste for so many of these spices. First of all, the language. I mean, there are, variations in the language just within a region, right? Of what people refer to, and of certain seeds, certain spices, certain dishes. And so that was throwing me. But I was impressed by the seed combination, the fermented nuts as a flavoring agent, and and the seeds, and that to me was really quite remarkable. What are some of the dishes that are really ubiquitous throughout all of the regions of Nigeria? Something that would identify the food of Nigeria. Is there anything in particular that you would say, yes, you'd find that on someone's plate?
I'd say that obviously there's several. They just go by different names per regional variation. I'd say akara as one of them. So akara is a fritter made from beans, black-eyed beans typically, or other forms of cowpeas. And you'll find it in the north, south, east, and west. And it goes by different names, but it's typically food of the home, but also street food. And it is very commonly consumed on Saturday for breakfast. So akara is definitely one. The other one is egusi. So I say egusi, but I mean egusi soup. And you'll find some variation of egusi soup across Nigeria. It's typically, egusi is like think about it as a close relative of pumpkin seeds. It's ground. It then has the texture of almond meal, and then it's kind of combined with liquids or used fried and forms the thickener and the base of a soup. And then across different regions, you'll find the egusi combined or prepared in different ways as it makes its way into the base of the soup, like a stock or a broth. In some places, it's a thin liquid that's streamed into the soup and you end up with a creamy sauce. In other places, the egusi is kind of combined with liquid just until it's a thick paste, and then it's spooned into this broth and cooked until it forms curds. So there are variations on how egusi is incorporated, but also across the regions, there are variations in the fermented seeds that bring that umami flavor and the greens that are used as well, but also how the greens are used.
Yeah, there were a lot of unusual to me, variety of greens used, as you say, just both for stewing and cooking in these soups, also as a vehicle for transferring, let's say, a dip or, wrapping around as we would like a lettuce leaf wrap around some meat preparation. But these are a lot of variety of greens and leaves used. I was impressed by that. How do the regional? There are what, like 6 regions of definitive regions in Nigeria, or and how do these regional differences impact the cuisine?
There's 6 broad regions with varying geographies. And the landscape, the waterscapes determine and shape what ends up on the plate. So you might find that some greens are more predominant in the Southwest versus in the North. Or that a particular function, let's say a viscosity of a particular green, is accomplished in the Southwest with jute leaves, popularly called ewedu in Yoruba. And in the North, it might be done with baobab leaves or sesame leaves, right? So the same goal, viscosity, accomplished with a variety of greens, depending on the region you're in.
That's so that as far as a lot of those dishes, what I know the different ingredients changed over time, those that were indigenous and those that were not. Talk about a little bit about some of the pre-colonist dishes and then post-colonist influences.
So pre-colonization or colonialism, ingredients that also still exist today, like millet, sorghum, varieties of West African rice, were quite popular, and they still exist today. Colonialism brought with it a greater increase in Asian-style rice. So whether that's long grain, basmati, the Indian basmati, the Thai jasmine and Vietnamese style jasmine rices became a little bit more popular. But you also had ingredients like cassava that were both post end of transatlantic enslavement. They existed prior to, but there's a certain knowledge of processing and technique that came towards the end of the 1800s and have continued today. So the foodways they're definitely pre and post-colonial foodways that you can kind of trace through specific ingredients.
Yeah. Cassava surprised me that it was more, well, the use of it, as you say, the preparation, how to treat it post colonialism. Yams, of course, I understand.
Yams have been there for yes, yams are indigenous, yes.
I know because I had done a show on Brazilian, the manioc movement, the cassava being ground into the flour they call manioc. Uh,
Farina de
so
manioc.
so that I was not surprised that the Portuguese actually um, sent it back from Brazil, but it just seemed to me that it was such an important ingredient in the West African
Oh,
food
it is.
that it was always there. All right.
It is. And then I think that's one amazing thing about Nigerian cuisine and largely across West Africa. It's this transformation of ownership in a way with some ingredients. Nigeria is now the largest producer of cassava in the world, I
Huh,
believe.
wow.
And the way that it's used is varied. It appears in so many dishes, but it's also interesting to see how people adopt introduced ingredients and kind of put their own shape it into their foodways in very unique and specific ways. And that's what I think about when I reflect on cassava and the way it exists in Nigeria.
Sure, certainly, right. Which uh, what I just love the names. Okay, because then I think of cassava, I think of the flour, I think of the manioc, and I think of fufu, of course. But then you say more than just fufu in your book, and
Yes.
you call these things, or they are called in Nigeria, swallows or chews. And now I
Yes.
love that. But you have to talk about that and describe what's a swallow and what's a chew. How do they differ, or don't they? And what they're made of.
Okay. So in Nigerian culinary language is quite interesting. I still find it fascinating.
Mm.
But there's a group of soft cooked doughs that are made from either the base ingredient or flours from base ingredients that are then, worked into creating this soft. I like to think of them as mochi type doughs or
Mhm.
or gnocchi even, right? So they have that soft, chewy consistency and texture that exists across cultures and cuisines. And in Nigeria, because typically people eat, you pinch off, you make the soft dough, it's cooked, and you pinch off some piece of it and dip it in a stew or a soup. And typically people swallow it. And so there's a general consensus that this category of dishes is called swallows. However, there are groups of people who don't swallow, who chew. And purist Nigerians might be like, it should be swallowed. But I am of the opinion that people who are making and enjoying dishes at home on their tables or that they've purchased have earned the right to eat the dish however they choose. And so I incorporated the words choose in that description. So that's one. The second thing is that globally, fufu is a word that's used to categorize this group of swallows. But however, in Nigeria, fufu is a very specific dish. It's not a category header, right? It doesn't speak to a class of dishes. It speaks to a very specific dish made from fermented cassava. And so that was something I really wanted to make clear with the heading more than fufu, just sharing that there's a whole variety of similar type doughs that are consumed and enjoyed.
Right. I look at them, and the pictures that you have in the book. Pictures are fabulous. It's a wonderfully illustrated book. It helps specifically when you're not being familiar with the nomenclature for these things or the spice. I have to say, you give wonderful glossaries, illustrated glossaries of spices and seeds and nuts, and it's wonderful. But I want to ask more specific questions about those. But the swallows often, when looking at the pictures, remind me of like a large dumpling.
Yes.
A doughy dumpling that would be put in a soup. It would help you, eat the broth. Although it's soup too. Soup can be, as you say, it's not what we think of when we think of soup all the time. It could be a
True.
stew, like a stew, right? A stew or a soup.
Yes. I agree with you that they're very similar to these cooked dumplings.
Mm.
And I've encountered some of those in Indian cuisine and in Nepalese cuisine, as well as in Czech cuisine. I went to Prague a few years ago, and I was shocked at these flour dumplings that reminded me very much of Nigerian style eba, made from manioc or cassava granules. So yes, in Nigeria, when we talk about soups, we are talking about what globally people might consider to be stews, and that's rich, thickened mixtures that combine nuts, seeds, greens, and other things in kind of like a thick outcome. And whereas people tend to think of soups as things that are drunk with spoons, in Nigeria, a soup is what you might consider to be a stew, even though we also have soups. So we also have drinking soups and broths as well.
Interesting. Well, then we get to the spices and the flavorings, but we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, I want you to tell the story of bouillon cubes. So stay with us.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. There's a reason when you think of Wisconsin, you think cheese. Cheese is a huge part of Wisconsin's history and future. In Wisconsin, the state of cheese, the tradition of cheese-making excellence began 180 years ago, before Wisconsin was recognized as a state. Immigrants traveled to settle in this lush green hills of Wisconsin, bringing their cheese-making traditions with them. These storied skills, combined with the freshest milk available, created a cheese-making culture that is uniquely Wisconsin. Wisconsin's 1,200 cheesemakers, many of whom are third and fourth generation, continue to pass on old world traditions while adopting modern innovations in cheese-making craftsmanship. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
Hi, I'm talking with Azaz Soko, and we're talking about Nigerian cuisine, of course. And I said I wanted you to talk about the story of bouillon cubes. Well, really, what I wanted you to do is talk about, again, the story of how the influences and how colonialists changed some of the foods. Talk about that, bouillon cubes.
I think bouillon cubes are an interesting combination of colonialism and global trade. And we see those marks across the globe. Like I can go into a grocery store in Mississauga where I live, and there'll be bouillon cubes on the shelves as well, right? So I think there's also the element of global trade and distribution. But it came in Nigeria, bouillon cubes are quite popular in some recipes, in some culinary establishments where they are seen to add flavor, umami type flavor, deep savory notes, a slight saltiness. But I also find that historically, and even to this day, we had fermented nuts, seeds that do the same, that bring the same deep savoriness, the same funk, the same saltiness, and also have a lot of pro or prebiotic characteristics as well. So there's been this tussle through time of, bouillon cubes replacing traditional seasoning, but I'm enthralled to see that traditional seasoning still features in many popular and enjoyed dishes, sauces, soups, and more. So, yeah, bouillon cubes exist, but I'm grateful that they haven't overtaken or completely replaced traditional seasoning.
Right. Well, you had mentioned too that some growing more cassava, and now, of course, you say that Nigeria is the largest producer, but that it did change when it was brought back by the slaves from Portugal, that it changed or disrupted the agricultural system a bit.
Yes, so I tend to think of the enslaved as people with distinct identities. So enslavement happened to them, and I don't necessarily think of them as slaves, but they brought back a lot of knowledge of how to process. So majority of Brazil had a huge population of enslaved Africans, who at the end of enslavement, who during enslavement became familiar with indigenous Amazonian cuisine, culture, techniques. And, they learned how to process cassava and its different varieties, how to differentiate and identify sweet from bitter cassava, because there are varying levels of toxins in them. So they learned peeling, the different fermentation processes, but also culinary uses as well. And they brought all that knowledge back to Nigeria. And cassava was something that colonialists favored in agricultural practices and growth, because it was hardy, it could grow, it was pest resistant. And so it was one of those crops that was pushed as a replacement for indigenous crops. And so that combination of it being readily available in markets, on farms, gardens, and this knowledge from the enslaved people made it thrive and made it grow. And then you found that Nigerians and West Africans created new uses, new culinary applications, and embedded it in this evolved food culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yet all of this was done too with the same, as you say, they never lost the I guess a use of seeds and flavorings from hundreds of years, like the fermented. So interesting. The fermented beans. Well, fermented beans, we know that's something we get from South Asia as well, Southeast Asia and China. But nuts, the fermented nuts, as you've mentioned a couple of times, and all of these different fermented beans, and the spice. When you say pepper, you don't just mean a particular kind of pepper. Let's talk pepper. Boy, did that have me confused. But I have to say, my attention was grabbed when you mentioned alligator pepper.
I love
I had to find out about that. Okay.
So I myself, kind of looking back with an anthropological linguistic lens at Nigerian culinary language, I'm always like fascinated with how certain words are used. So when you say pepper in Nigeria, it could mean a host of different things, and you kind of have to drill a little bit deeper to figure out which pepper is being referenced. So you could say pepper and mean like a stew base that's a combination of tomatoes, onions, and peppers, or tomatoes and pepper. But pepper also applies to spice. We also use the word pepper to describe spiciness. And you'll have everything from different peppercorns. So alligator pepper, for instance, is a cluster of almost brick red brown pyramidical seeds in a pod that has undulations and this textured character that is thought to resemble the skin of the alligator, hence the name.
Mm-hmm.
Some other people might know it as grains of paradise.
Oh, see, now that I didn't see that mentioned, then I would have known immediately, right?
Okay. It is there somewhere in the book.
Okay.
It is.
I did have to do a closer reading. Something that what I like is that when you do give a close substitution, like if you can't get this, close substitution might be that. But they're one of the grains that or the spices that I am very intrigued and anxious to try is Uda greens.
Oh, yes. I love Uda as well. So it's this long black pod that when I think of its character, the words smoky and musky come to mind.
Mm.
And in a way, it kind of reminds me of black cardamom.
Mm-hmm.
And I do call for black cardamom as a substitute if you can't find it.
Right.
It's processed in a similar way. It's very popular across West Africa. We use it in a variety of different ways. And if you've had Senegalese cafe tuba, which is a coffee, it has Uda ground with the coffee beans, and you just get this both rich, smoky, musky, but also slightly mentholy character to the drink.
That's great. Now, the other thing that I thought was one of the more unusual were the fermented locust beans. Well, locust beans have, you said, a lot of use, but the fermented locust beans. I think there was another one that got caught. Well, they all caught my attention, but no, ugba.
Uba.
That comes. This long, isn't that long bean?
Shreds. So you have these individual hard-shelled pods in a long pod, and the meat of, so you kind of open the bean, and then you have this kind of meaty oil bean that is then taken through several cycles of fermentation and then chopped, sliced, and then you end up with this kind of chewy, savory, salty bean that has a lot of character and that does a variety of things. You can add it to salads, you can include it in soups, but it's also fermented to be used as a condiment.
Interesting. Well, talking about how the one item has so many different uses, a big part you mentioned of the Nigerian cooking is no waste. Nothing goes to waste.
Yep. And yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it was something when I started hearing people talk about sustainability when I was younger and was at university in the UK in Liverpool, I was like, oh, it's a thing? Because this is how it's always been in Nigeria. Like I've always grown up knowing that, we could apply, we could use plantain skins, we could break them down after cooking to make culinary ashes that then get transformed into alkaline water that is then used as as alkalized wood. And so I was surprised that there were all of these new terminology globally for things that I was familiar with even before I could put names and words to them.
Right. The cow leg and biscuit bones. Really.
Yes.
Could you tell our listeners what biscuit bones are?
So biscuit bones, typically in Nigeria, we call them biscuit bones, but they're actually brisket bones.
Brisket.
Yeah, they're actually brisket bones. But I kind of like the analogy with biscuits, right? And when you're talking about biscuits in Nigeria, we're not talking about the American style biscuits that are more scone-like in Britain. We're talking about cookies. So we're talking about things that have crunch, that have a certain chewy crunch, if you would. And so biscuit bones are cartilaginous. They have this crunch, chew when cooked. There's also an auditory sound element to it that I think is endearing for me as a Nigerian. I love the crunch of cartilage when I'm eating. And so biscuit bone is included in pottages and in soups and in stews. And then cow leg is also similar. You have this gelatinous, when cooked, bit of meat that has a variety of textures. There's chew, there's crunch, there's unctuous. There are just so many different elements to it. And Nigerians really enjoy not just food, but the act and art of eating, right? Like, so you take cow leg and you would enjoy it. Like you would, I'm going to use a word that might be used with taking apart parts of a car, but you would dismantle that cow leg, and at the end you'll just literally have bones. But it would be a therapeutic, enjoyable feasting experience because you kind of have gone through all of the different parts and you'd enjoy the different textures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not unfamiliar to anyone who prefers the neck of a turkey as opposed to a big cut, or trotters, as we would call them.
Mm.
And you have to do a lot of picking to get what you want to eat out of it. Right? So I see a lot of that similarity, and as you say, that the no waste, which is something that's been around for a long time. Now we're sort of going back to the to that method of use. Rice, we just sort of did a quick pass over rice, but rice is was so important to the cuisine of Nigeria. So much so that those who knew how to grow it were highly prized, particularly in the slave trade. I mean, as you make mention to, in terms of setting up rice fields, the Carolina rice trade would not have existed otherwise without the knowledge of the slaves from the Western African nations.
Yeah.
But rice was it. But that's one type of rice is indigenous, is it not, to Nigeria?
Yes, and to many parts of West Africa. So, for context, there are two varieties of rice in the world. There is Oryza glaberrima, that's African rice, and there's Oryza sativa, Asian rice. And all the other varieties of rice kind of stem from these two. So African rice, Oryza glaberima, has been across West Africa for centuries. And, it was cultivated both in water or wet-based growing methods and dryland methods. And that's why during enslavement and during chattel slavery of Africans, people who had knowledge of growing rice were stolen, poached for their intellectual contributions, not just the physical labor that they contributed. And I think that's such an important thing to recognize, that enslaved people were highly specialized. They were botanists, agriculturists, they were surveyors. They knew how to work land, particularly wetlands. They were familiar with growing rice in swamp-based geographies. And so, like you shared, the success of rice in the Carolinas and Carolina gold rice varieties was largely due to their intellectual contributions. And yeah, that's something that I find incredibly fascinating and I like to acknowledge. And I was glad I was able to share some of that in the book.
Well, of course, the discussion of rice in West Africa would not be complete without talking about jollof rice.
Yes,
okay,
for sure. That delicious seasoned red rice that typically has a tomato stew base and that exists in various distinct forms across West Africa. Yeah, jollof rice is, for me, it's one of those dishes that I think has great historical significance because you can map changes in how jollof rice is made through time, looking at recipes in cookbooks. And so it's one of those things I think provides a through line for how cultures and cuisines and ingredients and methods have changed. It is an everyday dish as well as one that is present in many, many celebratory contexts in Nigeria.
Mhm.
Yeah, definitely. I try to make it on birthdays, even though my three teenage children aren't, these days, they aren't really fussed about whether or not there's jollof on their birthdays. But I try to make sure that, like, at Christmas, we have jollof, even if it's just a bowl in the fridge and no one's enjoying it but me. I'm like, the significance must remain. These rituals and these cultural practices will not fade away. I will keep them alive.
Well,
So,
what you
yes.
mentioned about tracing how it was made, through different cookbooks, that was another question I wanted to ask you, and that was, what role do the Nigerian cookbooks play in preserving this culinary history? And there you pretty much said
They
it.
play a great role. The thing that I'm desirous of and longing for is more food historians, um, Nigerian food historians, who can kind of do some of the work of tracing these connections. So,
Mhm.
for instance, I collect Nigerian cookbooks. That is one of my deepest passions. And I have jollof recipes from 1910, so over 115 years ago. A jollof recipe. And then I have jollof recipes all the way up to 1960 when we gained our independence, and also post that time period to the present day, okay, like the recipe in my book. And through looking at those recipes, I can see when certain ingredients came into use, when certain things fell out of use. I can see how, because originally jollof rice comes from the Wolof tribe in the Senegambian region of West Africa. And they make their jollof, chibujen, in a very specific way. Certain ingredients, certain vegetables feature. And in early recipes for jollof rice, you could see some of that resonance. You could see some of those ingredients that then now through time have changed. And just kind of mapping those, I find incredibly fascinating.
Right. That's very interesting, and especially since it's one specific area. I don't know how, West Africa, there's so many, it seems to me, so many of these dishes and flavors, of course, cross borders all over
Oh,
that
yes.
area. But how do you keep it specific to one area? That's not easy, right?
Well, I think the specificity comes naturally from what's available. So take akara, for instance, this bean fritter that in Nigeria and Brazil was made with beans.
Mhm.
You'll find akara everywhere across the Black Atlantic. So everywhere enslaved went or were forcefully taken, you'll find akara in one form or the other. Whether it is made with, in Haiti, for instance, it's made with malanga, that is taro root, but it still goes by the name akara. In the American South, you'll find a version called callus, made with rice. Across many parts of the Caribbean, you'll find versions made with pumpkin, saltfish, whitebait, or tiny fish called tui tui. So the name remains, the cultural practices and significance remain, but the ingredients shaped by the geographies and what is agriculturally available in those parts.
Mhm.
And it's just been fascinating for me. I'm deeply interested in global foodways and kind of mapping culinary and historical connections and creating map-based layers to kind of show all of the ways that we're connected in spite of our differences, but also to show the things, the elements that connect cultures and cuisines across thousands and thousands of miles and differing histories.
Yeah. That reminds me of, and now you have to help me with the correct pronunciation. To me, it looks like masa, but I know there are linguistic and etymological differences here with different accents and things on the word of the little fermented and sweetened rice cakes, masa, but with different
Rice
markings.
cakes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But do you just pronounce it masa?
Mm-hmm. In Nigeria, we call it masa.
Mesa.
Yes.
Okay. That, I mean, I was, so I did some reading about that and from your book particularly, and all of a sudden my head's getting filled with all these different little um, things that I relate to it, being idli from India, the South, particularly the South, karam,
Mm-hmm.
and what else was I thinking? A few other, a lot of little fermented rice cakes that are made everywhere, and then how they're enjoyed in so many different parts
Mm-hmm.
of the world. But tell me about that. That's a breakfast food primarily, right?
It's you can enjoy it for breakfast, but you can also have it for dinner.
Hmm.
So I'm from the south of Nigeria and grew up in the south. I first learned about masa when I was living in the Netherlands, and I tried to make South Indian appam. I made appam, which is similar to a version of masa.
Mm-hmm.
So masa is fried in pans with divots, but you could take the same batter and just fry it in a regular frying pan, and we would call it sinasir. So appams and sinasir are very, very similar. And in the process of working with South Indian appam, someone was like, a Nigerian was like, oh, we have this in Nigeria and it's sinasir, and then we have a version called masa. And I was like, what? Because masa is from the north of Nigeria. And though I was familiar with many aspects of cuisine from the north of Nigeria, I hadn't at that time, like 10 years ago, no, like 14 or 15 years ago, come across masa. And so I started researching and investigating and learning how to make it. And the name struck me as being very similar to Mexican masa, right? Which is this ground corn nixtamalized
Right.
mixture. And so in Nigeria, you actually have masa that is made with rice, but you also have masa that is made with corn, and you have masa that's made with millet. So maybe there is some connection, but I haven't been able to decode it yet. It's work in progress.
Well, that's
But
good. Good to know
yeah.
there's work to be done, right? What we haven't talked about, of course, are any sweets, any sweet desserts, any sweet things that
Ooh.
are what are some of the most popular, most traditional, and then again most popular, they could be different, of sweets that are part of the culinary tradition.
Nigerians are interesting when it comes to sweets, and the category is broad. So when we think of sweets in Nigeria, we can think of candy, and there are loads, both traditional candy, but also candy that has influence from Arabia and Arabic influence, particularly in the north of Nigeria. Mm-hmm. So you have sweets made with milk, you have caramel-based sweets, sweets and brittles with nuts, peanuts, sesame seeds. You have candy with baobab flour, so a little bit tangy, sour. So you have that candy category. And then you can also think of a group of, when Nigerians think about desserts or like sweets for after meals, it's usually fresh fruit. Mm-hmm. So we usually eat fresh fruit out of hand, or we make them into fruit salads. But you also have things like rice pudding with Afro-Brazilian roots, similar to Portuguese arroz doce. We call it arroz doce. And then you also have puddings like mingau de tapioca, similar to tapioca pudding, but made with granules instead of pearls, mm-hmm. and without eggs. So suitable for plant-forward, plant-based people who enjoy that plant-based diets. So yeah, sweets are a broad category, enjoyed at different times of the day and on different occasions.
Sure. I mean, everyone likes a sweet, at some point, but not the same as, let's say, the British or Americans with all their cookies and cakes. And
we do have cookies and we do have cakes.
Sure you do.
And but just I guess not on a so like we have cupcakes that I grew up knowing as cupcakes or queen cakes or angel cakes.
Mm.
So we have those. But if it yeah, I mean growing up, fruit salad was that thing that I reached for when I wanted something sweet. Or jelly and ice cream was very popular as well.
Yeah. I think the milk candy really caught my attention more than anything because it's first of all, the beautiful forms that it comes in, and also I can just imagine the smooth texture.
Yes, and it's not too sweet, but also it's one of those recipes that I think you could, like, if you didn't want to create beautiful forms, you could just flatten it in a pan and cut into diamonds or squares. But I like the idea of giving it a little bit more character using this beautiful decorative patterns. But you can also flavor it in different ways. The base takes well to a variety of explorations.
Wow. You know, I wanted to make sure that I made some mention about um, palm oil. I mean, we can look at all these wonderful palm trees and you see the pictures, but the palms you depend on the different varieties of palms for so many things. Um, but tell me about the palm oil.
I'm going to make a very clear distinction between what people between palm oil, because the version of palm oil that people in the global north are probably familiar with is a highly industrialized, fractionated, bleached, and deodorized version of palm oil that exists in everything from cookies to margarine, soaps, and
The
things
one that
like
gets
that.
a bad rap, in other words.
The one that gets a bad rap, yes. And that one doesn't have its origins in West Africa. I need to make that as a geographical distinction between the sources of red palm oil and others. So red palm oil you find it across West Africa, Central Africa, but you'd also find it in Brazil, where in these regions, it has deep cultural significance as medicine, as food, as an ingredient that is part and parcel of practices, traditional rituals and practices, and is revered. Red palm oil in Nigeria is a healthy oil that brings color, flavor, deliciousness to a variety of dishes. We use it, it's typically grown in smallholder, by smallholder farmers, processed in small batches, to the extent that I'm often sad to say, but sometimes we do import palm oil from other countries just because sometimes the local production is not sufficient to meet local demand and needs. So a very beloved ingredient that isn't associated with many of the things we often read about. And I think it's important that people are aware of the differences and probably do some research and exploration to learn a little bit more about why what's touted in the media is not the only story. I think avoiding the singular pitfall of listening to only what is touted in media is something that I'd like to share. And I'm glad that you kind of highlighted that. So
well, there's a picture in the front of the book, which is just, I mean, it's wonderful. Just this wonderful, unctuous liquid of bright red flowing into a container. I mean, how could it not catch my attention?
I have to say a huge thank you to my friend and photographer, James Ransom, for the amazing work he did telling the photography stories. They're we spent time in Nigeria, we spent time in the studio in Mississauga, and James really brought heart, courage, and a beautiful eye to capturing the people, the food, the place of Nigeria. So I'm
You know,
deeply, deeply grateful for that.
absolutely did indeed. And together with your inclusive research and just wonderful detail about all of the different ingredients and foodways and history. It really is a book that it's something that whether one cooks from it a lot or not, to me, it's a book that one would refer to a lot to source and identify and understand the different ingredients. And I thank you for that, because those are the books that I prize on my shelf.
Oh, thank you so much, Linda. I really wanted to write a book that celebrated Nigerian culture and cuisine, but also brought my love for research and science and knowing on an elemental foundational basis to light. I
Well,
wanted
it
to
shows.
celebrate.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
definitely shows. And I thank you for your time and sharing all this information with us today, because I think that my listeners are going to find this, very interesting. And I hope that they will pick up a copy of the book, which comes out next month in March, right?
Yes, 18th of March. So I'm thankful for the opportunity to be in conversation with you. Thank you for your thoughtful questions, highlighting various elements of Chop Chop, cooking and food
Hopefully
in
we can do it again.
Nigeria.
There's so much
Yes,
to it.
and
Okay.
yes, and I hope that your readers would pre-order, but also ask me questions, invite me to discussions. I'm happy to share my love and passion for my culture and cuisine. So thank you very, very much.
And to you.
It's been my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And thank you to all my listeners. And this has been another Taste of the Past. A Taste of the Past is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.